Most of us think of asbestos as a problem that was solved decades ago, a toxic mistake we legislated away. But if you zoom in close enough on modern cosmetic powder, certain children's toys, or the insulation in your attic, you might find something terrifying: microscopic, indestructible, needle-like fibers. For most of the 20th century, these fibers were deliberately injected into daily life. Manufacturers packed them into consumer products, from the fake snow in department store windows and even into personal appliances like this vintage hairdryer. Asbestos possessed an almost magical combination of physical traits. It was highly resistant to fire and boasted a tensile strength comparable to steel wire. That made it the perfect, cheap backbone for the global industrial and construction boom. As the death toll from exposure mounted, the public demanded action. In 1989, the Environmental Protection Agency issued a sweeping rule to phase out almost all asbestos use in the United States. 2 years later, a landmark lawsuit overturned that ban on a legal technicality. The idea that we are completely protected from this toxin is an illusion. Asbestos remains an active legal threat, shielded by decades of regulatory loopholes. When inhaled, stiff, needle-like fibers travel deep into the lungs, physically spearing the soft tissue walls. Specialized immune cells, called macrophages, arrive to digest the debris, but the asbestos fibers are too rigid. The macrophages are pierced and destroyed. This triggers an unwinnable microscopic war inside the body. Decades of chronic inflammation and scarring culminate in severe respiratory failures and fatal cancers like mesothelioma. The tragedy is that the asbestos industry knew exactly what was happening. Internal corporate documents, like the infamous Sumner Simpson papers, revealed that executives were tracking the deaths of their own workers as early as the 1930s and actively chose to bury the evidence. Instead of warning the public or altering their business models, these corporations opted for silence. Generations of workers were systematically treated as disposable commodities to maintain multi-billion-dollar profit margins. The danger didn't stop at the factory gates. After a long shift, workers walked home covered in a heavy layer of industrial dust. This created a silent chain reaction known as take-home or para-occupational exposure. The microscopic fibers were transferred to furniture and bedding and uncontaminated clothing, turning simple acts like doing the laundry or hugging a spouse into a lethal event. Some of the most vulnerable victims were children. Because they crawled and played close to the ground, their breathing zones were right next to the highest concentrations of settled dust. An industrial hazard successfully bypassed every physical boundary, infiltrating the home and turning entirely innocent family members into collateral damage years down the line. Today, the survival of the asbestos industry relies on careful legal definitions. One of the most glaring is the 1% rule, which dictates that if a product contains less than 1% asbestos by weight, the government legally considers it asbestos-free. This animation illustrates the fatal flaw in the industry standard testing method, known as Polarized Light Microscopy. It uses visible light to scan for asbestos. The problem is that this test literally cannot see the smallest, thinnest fibers. They slip straight through undetected, despite being the exact fibers most likely to penetrate deep into human lungs. The consequences of relying on this flawed test are devastating. Following the collapse of the World Trade Center on September 11th, Lower Manhattan was blanketed in a massive cloud of pulverized building materials. Officials utilized these outdated, low-sensitivity testing methods to assess the hazard. They quickly declared the air safe to breathe, exposing thousands of first responders and residents to a toxic environment that has since caused thousands of severe illnesses. These exact same blind spots allow contaminated talc to legally wind up in modern makeup aisles. Because asbestos and talc are mined from the exact same geological deposits, cross-contamination is common. But weak testing requirements let the fiber slip right through into consumer goods. Our current regulatory safety nets are working exactly as designed. They are deliberately blind to low concentrations and tiny fibers, allowing a known carcinogen to persist legally in our daily environments. As we grapple with this legacy, it becomes clear that the burden of exposure does not fall evenly across society. Marginalized communities and underfunded school districts are disproportionately affected. As the asbestos-laden materials in aging, neglected buildings degrade, they release toxic dust into the air. Safely existing in, let alone renovating, these spaces requires extensive containment protocols and hazmat gear that poorer districts simply cannot afford. Meanwhile, wealthy multinational corporations continue to operate massive terraced open-pit mines. They extract millions of tons of asbestos and export it to developing nations, where labor is cheap and occupational safety oversight is practically non-existent. The United States government only just finalized a ban on one specific type of asbestos, Chrysotile, in 2024. That ruling leaves 5 other recognized types of asbestos completely untouched, along with the millions of tons already woven into our existing infrastructure. We need comprehensive overhauls to our testing standards and total, uncompromising global bans on every variety of this mineral. Believing this is a solved problem only serves the industries profiting from the status quo. Asbestos stands as a chilling testament to the power of corporate lobbying. Through carefully crafted loopholes and suppressed science, an indestructible killer has secured a permanent, legal residency right alongside us.